Hi everyone, in today's talk we're going to share Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy's theory, which is basically called monopoly capital. And we're going to locate Baran and Sweezy within an overall way of thinking, which we call Neo-Marxism, which is a type of Marxism. It takes Marxist ideas, but extends Marxist arguments into different domains. I'll try and show you what I mean today. So in summary, what we can see is that Baran and Sweezy are particularly focusing on and critical of the role of large corporations and of imperialism, and that there's a link between, in particular, there's a link between large corporations and imperialism, which we'll look at the way they establish this link today. Just as a quick introduction, Paul Baran was a Stanford University economics professor, and in fact, for his career, he was the only Marxist tenured professor in the United States. A lot of people who were Marxists were sort of excluded from academia as a result of the McCarthy trials that happened during this period, and it just wasn't a friendly environment for Marxists. He's famous for The Political Economy of Growth, which is a book that helped establish some of the concepts we're looking at today. And then along with Paul Sweezy, wrote Monopoly Capital in 1966. Baran had an interesting life. He was born in pre-revolutionary Russia, and then he moved all around Europe. Eventually, he escaped persecution by the Nazis and ended up in the United States. I don't know why anybody would want to complete 2 doctorates, but he wanted to, and he attempted to complete a PhD at Harvard, his second PhD, but ran out of cash, and therefore he ended up working in the US government. So he worked at the Office of Price Administration, which we should be familiar with from last week, because that was where John Kenneth Galbraith worked. He also worked at the Office of Strategic Services. So he worked with Galbraith, and in some ways we can see that there's an influence perhaps between the two of them. So after the war's over, he meets Paul Sweezy, who's editing the journal Monthly Review, and they become lifelong co-authors and friends. Paul Sweezy has the same birthday as me, and therefore he's fantastic. He studied at Harvard and basically takes a summer off to go to London School of Economics, and there at the London School of Economics, he becomes introduced to Marxism. He's doing his PhD under Schumpeter, who I've mentioned a couple of times in some of the talks this semester. Schumpeter's an interesting guy, and you know, if I had more time in this course, I'd probably want to talk about him a bit more, but look into him. What's really interesting about their relationship is that Sweezy ends up getting into some really interesting debates with Schumpeter. So, you know, with your supervising professor, I guess, you're supposed to have this close relationship, and they end up as sparring partners. Sweezy was always an activist first, and perhaps an academic second. He attempted to organize the Harvard teaching staff into a labor union, and you know, Harvard's known as a kind of elite university. So if you're even organizing Harvard's teachers, I guess it shows you're really passionate about unions and about labor issues. Sweezy also worked for a number of US government agencies, and one of the first big influences on his career was when he conducted the study Interest Groups in the American Economy. And in this paper, in this research project, he's looking closely about the major powers in US capitalism and how they work together. So he's a decorated military veteran, not a combat veteran, but he's awarded military medals for his service to the Office of Strategic Services, and doing data analysis and stuff. And then he teaches briefly at Harvard before retiring to become a full-time writer and editor of Monthly Review, which is one of the more famous, I guess, socialist-leaning journals in history, at least in the 20th century. So in the book Monopoly Capital, an essay on the American social order, Baran and Sweezy are looking at a big problem that they perceive to exist within Marxist theory. Right, so if we remember back to Marx, he develops Capital, which is his critique of political economy. And Marx's argument is that capitalism is basically going to be a competitive system. So therefore, what's wrong with capitalism if it works competitively? Now, what we've seen in the last few weeks is that there's a lot of different perspectives that have challenged this idea that capitalism works as a competitive system, that instead maybe it gets dominated by, you know, large corporations or that sort of thing. So the neo-Marxists are going to look into, like, they're going to take Marxist concepts and apply them to a world that is not such competitive capitalism, to a world of monopoly capitalism. So Baran and Sweezy are going to use the Marxist method and apply it to what they see as the reality, that capitalism is not a competitive system, so non-competitive capitalism. And here's a quote. We say that we must recognize that competition, which was the predominant form of market relations in 19th century Britain, has ceased to occupy that position not only in Britain, but everywhere else in the capitalist world. Today, the typical economic unit has attributes that were once thought to be possessed only by monopolies. All right, so what does he mean by this? Well, it's things like these facts that of the largest 60 economic units in the world, the 60 of them, so that should say 30 of them, 30 are corporations and the other 30 are countries. Okay, so what they're analyzing here is that some corporations are now so big that they're more significant than many countries, right? ExxonMobil is a primary example because its GDP is so big that its GDP is larger than 166 different countries in the world, right? So this is a giant sort of, if we call ExxonMobil an economy, it's a bigger economy than most countries, right? But it's a corporation. So it occupies this weird space where it's so big and so significant and it's exercising so much central power, but it's not a state. So it's not a country itself. So to summarize their argument, what we can see is that monopoly or oligopoly conditions exist, and this enables businesses to raise their prices to a very high level, above what's considered, an equilibrium level or a competition-related level. Okay, but while this is good in the short term, the long-term problem this generates for capitalists is that they run out of things to invest in or consume. Right, so they run out of ways to make money. In order to continue to accumulate capital, they need the intervention of government. And what type of intervention from government do they need? They need government to be paid in an imperialist and militarist way. Destroy stuff, conquer people, create new markets through the destruction. Right? And these new forms of investment, war, conquest, destruction, and then the rebuilding of an economy after it's destroyed becomes the new form of investment. So the other prediction that they make is that as a result of this, finance, insurance, and real estate, so financial capital, will become increasingly important relative to industrial capital. So industry is going to take on a less important role over time because it's less able to, respond to these new conditions. So one of the key concepts in the argument is that of economic surplus, which Baran started to develop in The Political Economy of Growth. And a basic definition of this is what a society produces and the costs of producing it. So the size of the surplus is an index of productivity and wealth, how much freedom a society has to accomplish whatever goals it may set for itself. The composition of the surplus shows how it uses that freedom, so how much it invests in expanding productive capacity, how much it consumes in various forms, how much it wastes, and in what ways. Okay, that's from Monopoly Capital, page 9. So the economic surplus, this concept, basically they're arguing that in a monopoly or in an oligopoly form of capitalism, the surplus is going to grow, but not in a healthy and productive way, right? The growth is not, in the end, a good thing because capitalists run out of places to invest the money, right? As a result of this, corporations are going to compete with each other, but they're not competing over price. They're competing for segments of the market, doing things like product differentiation. Where can we see this? Well, Coke and Pepsi is a really good example. The relative price of Coke and Pepsi compared to, other commodities in the economy has stayed basically the same for most of their history of competition. And yet the advertising budget of Coke and Pepsi is massive, right? They're spending billions of dollars in advertising during this period. So as a metaphor for capitalism as a whole, what we can see then is that there's this rise in unproductive labor. Corporations end up spending a lot of money on things like sales, advertising, and marketing. And if we remember back to Adam Smith, these are things that are not producing new commodities, right? So it's unproductive labor. And the end result of that is economic stagnation. Another way of looking at the surplus or understanding it is to look at it sort of, pseudo-algebraically, I guess. So we can think of the surplus as the GDP minus the production costs, for example. So how much does a nation produce minus how much does it cost to produce it? So only a little bit of this is the necessary cost. We can also think of advertising, marketing, finance, and managerial costs as existing, but these are wasteful, so they're not necessary for production. So if they're part of our production cost, they're being used wastefully. So therefore, the surplus is actually being divided in many ways. We can also think of it as profits, interest, taxes, advertising, and management costs, right? And some of those things we need, and some of them we don't really need, but they just exist for historical reasons. So why does the capitalists run out of ways to invest productively? Baran and Sweezy give 5 basic reasons for this. So the first reason is that the capitalist class cannot manage to spend enough money to consume all of this extra value, right? Capitalists certainly do spend a lot of money on luxury consumption. This is kind of Veblen's point, if we remember back, the leisure class idea, that you have this unproductive consumption and it's luxury type consumption that indicates social status, right? Fine. Baran and Sweezy say this class tries its best to spend all it can on luxury, but it can't expand its consumption fast enough to absorb all the extra value. In order to do that, they'd have to spend billions and billions of dollars on themselves, not invest billions of dollars. So next, that large firms need to spend a lot of money on sales and marketing, and we know sales and marketing doesn't create any new commodities. This is waste, right? So this is not really an investment. Next, the class struggle limits the spending power of the average citizen. So here's where the Marxist concept is used. Because there's this struggle for power between the capitalists and the working class, which keeps working class wages lower, they don't have enough money to spend on all of these things that are produced in the marketplace, right? So their demand is being limited. They can't just keep buying all these new products that get developed. But on the other hand, what can be expanded easily is war and destruction. Okay, so war and destruction is easy to do. It creates opportunities for production because once you've destroyed some stuff, then it's that creates the demand to replace what you've destroyed. Okay, and then finally we have the financial sector, which does create a lot of instability. Here's where they agree with Keynes and Galbraith and some of the people we've talked about in the last few weeks. But they say, well, okay, the finance sector can act as an outlet for surplus, but the biggest problem with it is it's also unproductive. It ends up creating a sort of economic casino where everybody's just basically betting on what's going to go up and what's going to go down, and there's some winners and some losers. So it creates an unstable system. So it's not really a real investment. So the end result of monopoly capitalism, according to Baran and Sweezy, is imperialism. So because there is no productive outlet for investment, instead corporations start pushing for an outward projection of power. So capitalists link up with the state. Why the state? Because it's just not seen as legitimate for capitalists to have their own private armies, right? They need a country to attach themselves to in order to legitimately use power. And here we say that the business of war is profitable. In 2011, the largest 100 contractors sold 410 billion in arms and military service, just 10 of those companies, 208 billion. So based on a list of the top 100 arms producing and military service companies in 2011, compiled by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Wall Street reviewed the 10 companies with the most military sales worldwide. And if we follow the link, they're all in the United States. So here's a link between big monopoly corporations, most of which are either headquartered or most of their investment is in the United States, and the military projection power of the United States. So for Baran and Sweezy, things like poverty and inequality are just an inevitable part of monopoly capitalism. What do they mean by that? Well, there is enough food and money in the United States, for example, to make sure that everybody, nobody is poor, that everybody gets educated, that everybody has a job, right? These things could all be accomplished. There's enough food and money in the world to make sure nobody's poor, that everybody's educated and everybody gets a job, right? If we count it, we have more than enough money to accomplish all these things. So what's stopping it from happening? Well, their argument is that corporate interests prevent this from occurring. Why do they prevent it? Because they want to structure our economy in such a way that they get to maximize their corporate profits. So what seems like a rational system in the sense of resource allocation and maximization of profit and that sort of thing is a very irrational system in terms of the way that it meets human needs. It seems strange that we continue to exist, where poverty exists in a world that we have enough money not to be poor now. It doesn't necessarily need to exist. So the result, I guess, of higher productivity is interesting to think about, because we always get told that higher productivity is going to make the society richer and more efficient. And let's recall Keynes, because why not? Right, in 1930, Keynes wrote an article which was called "The Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren." And maybe if you're particularly young great-grandchildren, he's talking about us, right? He's talking about future generations. And his argument was basically, if we can increase productivity, eventually that's going to lead to a situation where everybody gets to work less. Right? We spend less time at work because the basic conditions for existence can be reproduced without so much labor. Okay. Now, Baran and Sweezy point to this and say, well, why hasn't this happened? We've had amazing developments in technology. We're more productive than we ever are. And yet it seems like people are working just as long and sometimes even longer than before. Right? So when productivity increases are occurring, it seems like corporations are absorbing most of them in the form of higher profits. So everybody else is not getting a share of these productivity increases. That brings us to this concept of tacit collusion and price leadership, right? So if we go back to Adam Smith, Smith had a generally positive view of capitalism. We should remember that. But he did warn us against the formation of monopolies. So he said, people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. This is a quote from The Wealth of Nations. Now, Baran and Sweezy said, collusion doesn't need to have a meeting to occur. We don't need official meetings or collaboration between firms. Simply, when one firm raises its prices, other firms can follow its behavior. And this developed a concept which we call price leadership, where one corporation raises its price and the others all raise their price too, because they realize they can. They realize there's space in the market for a price increase. Okay, so this is why what looks like a competitive system behaves like a monopoly system. So we're basing our understanding on competition. If one firm unilaterally raises its prices, that supposedly makes the other firms more competitive, that firm is going to have to reduce its price over time. Okay, so a competitive system is behaving like a monopoly system. What does this help us understand? Well, for one, why the 20th and 21st centuries have had continuous inflation. Okay, we've seen alternative explanations for inflation, like the money supply and that sort of thing. Baran and Sweezy's explanation for inflation is simply like for inflation is that, this is not a competitive system. The reason prices of things keep increasing is because people are demonstrating price leadership. And so prices are objectively rising relative to incomes. It's also a good explanation for why the working day is not getting shorter. So if all the productivity increases in the world are getting turned into higher prices, that would explain why we still have to work as long as we do instead of taking less time at work. So the next indicator we have, the next bit of evidence in favor of this understanding of monopoly capitalism is what we call mergers and acquisitions. So this is where one company buys another company. Now, mergers are a very important part of corporate life. You can merge with another corporation for a few reasons. You can do it to reduce competition. It's what we call a horizontal merger, where you buy your competition. You buy your competition, and therefore you have less competition in the market, right? You can also expand into a new product or a market area. So you buy a company that works in the area that you want to expand into, right? Finally, you have reducing supply costs. This is what we call a vertical merger, where you buy the company that supplies your company and it becomes part of your company instead. Now, what's interesting is that about 80% of foreign direct investment in the world is used for these mergers and acquisitions. When we think of foreign direct investment, we're encouraged to think of it as a creative process. It's like, this is new money that's coming into our economy. It's going to create new things. Is it? Well, no, because if the evidence is that 80% of foreign direct investment is mergers and acquisitions, that means most foreign and direct investment is actually not creating anything new. It's taking over something that already exists, right? So what this indicates is that these corporations are growing in their power, they're expanding across the globe. So they're behaving in a way that Baran and Sweezy predicted. So large corporations, what role do they play in terms of innovation? And Baran and Sweezy argue something quite controversial, that actually they stifle innovation, they don't promote it. So when a new industry or a field operations is being opened up, the big corporation tends to hold back deliberately and allow individual entrepreneurs or small business to do the vital pioneering work, what we would call a startup. It's at this stage that the big corporations move to the center stage. The record of the giants is one of moving in, buying out, and absorbing smaller creators. So corporations basically hate spending money on things like innovation, because it's sort of not the most surefire way of getting a profit. It's much easier to just pick a winner and invest in that. Okay, so they use their position of power to buy out the people who do spend money on innovation. So this leads to a situation where new products and new processes get introduced not immediately, not competitively necessarily. New technology is not introduced all at the same time. It gets introduced in a controlled fashion, just enough to be competitive with what's happening in the marketplace, not enough that you're aggressively competing at all. Right, so now the counterpoint to this is that Baran and Sweezy said that, well, the problem with imperialism is that it doesn't always work, and therefore imperialism cannot fully stabilize the capitalist system. Now, this is, I guess, a subject of ongoing debate, but the key point here is that if you're a country and you're subject to imperialism, if another country is attacking you and trying to dominate you politically, they're going to resist this domination. So resistance will occur to the domination of monopoly capital. So unsurprisingly, when this resistance is successful, so if it's lengthy or well organized, this seems to coincide with economic crisis in the United States. For example, the US loses the Vietnam War, it has an economic crisis. The US has extremely long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan where it doesn't really achieve its objectives. They have an economic crisis, 2008. So it seems like there's a link between successful resistance to an imperialist project and economic crisis. These things seem to coincide. So, we can think about lots of different corporations. I've listed Huawei here. Why does most of the world capitalism dislike this corporation so much? Right? And if we take Baran and Sweezy's theory, we can come up with a reasonable answer why many Western governments and corporations don't like Huawei. So it's a phone company, it's a technology company, it produces high technology, innovative materials, but it's innovative. So it's been on the cutting edge of innovation in this space, and it won't merge with Western corporations, right? What role does it play? It helps to deny market access to other corporations. So it's reducing the profit-making potential of foreign direct investment. It's reducing the profitability of Western capital. It's willing to compete with these monopoly corporations, and doing this reduces monopoly profits. So the more competitive the system is by having this new Chinese company introduced into the process, the lower the monopoly profits are. And then it has connections to a sovereign power. So, a lot of people link Huawei with the Chinese state, I guess, and the resistance of the Chinese state to US imperialism. All of these reasons are reasons that Baran and Sweezy would say, well, Huawei looks like a good example of something that monopoly capitalism would dislike. So the other bit of their theory is about the sales effort. And what we can see is that investment in capital goods, so factories and things that generate production, have continuously expanded in the United States in the last century. And what's interesting is that capital goods have expanded even during economic recession. So even when people stop buying as much stuff, okay? So roughly 2/3 of all output in the US is bought by consumers. And what this means is the economy is really dependent on consumer spending. This kind of Keynes' point in the end was that we need to make sure people feel confident to spend or the economy starts to die. Okay, so if corporations are unwilling to increase wages because wages are connected to profits, higher wages, lower profits, then what do they have to do? Well, they need to increase the sales effort. They need to make sure that people keep spending as much of their money as possible. We can look at the sales effort in practice. In 1940, the US saving rate, so the percentage of total income, was estimated at about 9% of total income. And what we've seen is this actually declines to the 2000s, where the average saving rate is 0.4%, a substantial decline in the rate of savings. And we would argue that, Americans have a very, very low savings rate, a very small percentage of their money they actually keep. They're spending most of it, okay? Now, it's no coincidence that during the same time, advertising expenditure has exploded from roughly 10 billion to roughly 300 billion US dollars, okay? And there's an example of the fact that advertising works. Why does it work? Let's take a look. Okay, so sales culture has a huge impact on our society, and Smith's invisible hand claimed that individual selfishness would lead to a social good. But what we can see is the significant evidence that this isn't true. We can look at pollution or conspicuous consumption, look at some of the arguments from the different theories we've studied in this course. And what we see is that a lot of this stuff comes from consumerism driven by advertising. Let's look at a few interesting points. So Americans spend a full year on average of their lives just watching television commercials. So when they die, they can die with the knowledge that 1 year of their life on average has been spent watching TV commercials, not just TV, this is just TV advertising. Next, by the age of 20, most Americans have seen 1 million advertisements on average. All right, so they've witnessed 1 million ads. Every hour of television watched in the United States is estimated to increase consumer spending by about $200 US. So a lot of people argue, oh, advertising never works and stuff. Why is it even there? Isn't it a waste of time? Isn't it a waste of money? Isn't it the thing that disrupts my viewing experience? Well, it exists because it works. So parents on average spend about 6 hours a week shopping and spending money on these consumer goods, but about 40 minutes per week playing with children on average. So this is a comparative study. We might say that we love our families and stuff like that, but we obviously love shopping more, at least if we behave the same way as Americans do. 6 hours of shopping, 40 minutes of playing with children. And then the average American watches about 34 hours of television per week, right? So, you can think about the 40-hour week as a reasonable working week. The Americans almost work a working week in terms of watching TV, 34 hours a week live, and then an additional 6 hours watched taped, so recorded programming. And all of this programming is full of advertising everywhere. Right, so the sales effort is real. It's a major part of the way capitalism works. It's all around us. It's everywhere. Everywhere we look, we can see some sort of effort at driving sales. So government also can play the role of absorbing surplus. And if advertising fails, government can, if it needs to, absorb part of this economic surplus. Even though the United States has spent the last 20, 30, 40 years arguing for free markets and free trade, it's interesting that during the same period, US government expenditure as a percentage of US GDP grew from 10% in 1920 to 35% in 2012. Right, so if you're a person who supports small government and free markets, what they often miss is that when government reduces expenditure, the private sector does have more money, but it also has more savings that it has to find productive investment for. If it can't find productive investment, if it can't provide profitable investment outcomes, then it has a problem. What do we do with that money? That's the road to an economic crisis. All right, so one of the most common ways for government to absorb surplus is through military spending. Spend on the military. It's the ultimate demand-driven way of creating, resolving an economic crisis. Government can also spend money on things like social needs. We can pay people to become less poor, for example. But it's interesting that this rarely happens in monopoly capitalist societies, right? There aren't a lot of examples where this actually occurs. So one of the key books that happens as a result of Baran and Sweezy's work is what we call Labor and Monopoly Capital, the Degradation of Work. So it's a book that starts what's called labor process theory. And I'll briefly summarize Harry Braverman, the author, who makes this argument. He's talking, well, let's take monopoly capital as an idea, and let's look specifically at the impact monopoly capital has on the quality of work that people will do in the future. He's talking about our time now. So as monopoly capital makes society more of a surplus accumulating society, Braverman's argument is that capitalists will respond by mechanization and de-skilling. So jobs will become more machine driven. Jobs will become less skilled as a result. We won't have to be as skilled. Okay, so highly skilled workers get replaced by machines and unskilled workers, and that's what we call de-skilling. Capitalism could respond by intensifying the labor process and measuring and controlling it. Okay, what we notice is that either of these options are great options for the capitalist. Make more work intense, or make more work, more mechanized. Okay? But they're bad for the worker because they create boring jobs, unemployment, and stress. Nobody wants a less skilled job to do. Everybody wants an interesting job to do. Nobody wants a more intense labor process. Keynes and everybody was predicting a less intense labor process where we work less hours or less intensely. Okay, so instead of machines replacing labor, which was what Keynes imagined was going to happen, machines have seemed to have the effect of making labor both more stressful and more boring than they've ever been in the past. So to summarize Baran and Sweezy's perspective, what we can see is that most of the economy, according to this perspective, is dominated by corporations, and these corporations want to prevent a competitive system. Okay, the process of capital accumulation forces profits to be reinvested. Capitalism needs to continually reinvest the profits that it makes in order for the system to keep going and keep existing. But there are limited opportunities for this type of investment. So imperialist governments like the United States stabilize the system through military spending and provide assistance to US corporations. Destroy a bunch of stuff and then pay US corporations to rebuild it. A large part of the surplus is wasted on things like advertising and the sales effort, especially on goods that don't really serve any real needs. They're just being created in order to be sold, in order to sustain the system in some way. And finally, corporations absorb productivity increases as profits. Increased productivity does not necessarily reduce prices or increase wages. So a very dismal view of capitalism this week. Baran and Sweezy's monopoly capital theory, and I'll look forward to discussing this in class with you. Join in next week for Carl Polanyi, the final lecture of the course. I hope you've enjoyed the talk today. Thanks for listening.